I just met Wes on New Year's Eve. A friend held an event at his home where Wes gave a really great lecture about, it was based on a book by David Graeber, and talked a lot about just kind of the history of the United States and slavery and kind of these concepts of freedom, the ideals that are thrown around a lot in this country, and had a really wonderful conversation. And so when we saw that Amory United was putting on this Black History Month event with a different speaker every week, I thought Wes would be a perfect speaker for this. Really wonderful historian, really great analysis of, yeah, just history and race relations and capitalism and all the things that we're kind of dealing with in this modern era as fallout of, yeah, just the history of this continent. I guess, Wes, if you want to kind of take it from here, and then just let us know when you're done, and we can do some Q&A at the end.
Okay, so folks, here's what I'm going to do. My friend Klaus here asked me to touch base on a number of things, and I thought perhaps I could give you a tour of American history, but not just in the sort of context of just looking at the United States itself, but the United States in relation to the Caribbean, and in this way, as well as the United States in terms of its development of racist ideology and the global impact that has had. Okay, so I'll give some analysis about that, and then we can come together to have some Q&A. So it will not be necessarily just one straight teleology of one story to the next, but different segments of American history. So, but first, because we're talking about race and capitalism and its connection to imperialism, I think first is to start with me giving you a quick overview of how historians think about race. So in the 1920s, the Supreme Court ruled against Asians who were seeking American citizenship. And it started with an immigrant from Japan who claimed to be whiter than the average Italian, Spaniard, or Portuguese. But the court said he could not claim to be white because he was of the Mongolian race, and therefore ineligible for citizenship. Throughout the decades, there have been many cases like these whereby non-white and non-black groups have tried to gain American citizenship by defining themselves as white, but are nevertheless rejected. So we have to ask ourselves, why was that? Why was that the case? Well, what these cases in many ways demonstrate are two essential qualities of race. First, race is a historical fact. It has a historical origin, and therefore, because it's historical, it also is an ideology. And as scholars have argued for decades, race is socially constructed. This is often repeated now, and people understand it, but do not understand how it fits within history. It means that race, in some ways, is not a scientific concept or some timeless biological reality, but something that was invented in order to secure a permanent labor force. And how does that work? Well, oftentimes we talk about race by taking it as a given. In fact, the way it works is that racism is the ideology that a group of people developed in order to create race, which then becomes the marker whereby you can secure a permanent pool of labor. Therefore, it was very easy to, in a way, capture the labor of Africans and African Americans, because so long as you can designate who is an enslaved person on account of their skin color, then it did not make for much work. You have to remember that slavery itself had existed for millennia in many parts of the world, all parts of the world. In fact, the word slavery comes from the root word Slavs, right? The Slavic people. So it wasn't until slavery in the New World that what was initially Christian supremacy came into contact with the racist ideology that created race to then manufacture a system whereby you create an underclass that would benefit um, not just white people. More specifically, we have to think about it, a class of planters. Um, so that's the root. That's how we should understand race. It is that it started with racism as an ideology that created race, and therefore here we are. But no matter how arbitrary or absurd racial designations are, we do know that they have real consequences. For instance, the United States has traditionally operated according to the one drop rule. What does that mean? It means that not simply appearance determines whether one is white or black, but also a form of restricting intermarriage, which was called miscegenation. Therefore, in order to enslave someone, it all you had to sort of go by is if their mother was black or not. So that a white woman can give birth to a black child while a black woman cannot give birth to a white child, even if the children looked exactly the same. So, in many ways, the reason why we need to understand how race works and the reason why I'm giving you this background is because it has now become fashionable in recent discussions to argue that one or another immigrant group, whether that be Irish, Italian, Jews, somehow became white as part of the American melting pot assimilation process. The problem with that argument is that it is not true. Has no place in history. It's ahistorical because many of these groups, in the context of European American history, were already white to begin with. No one had tried to prevent, say, Irish, Jewish, or Italian immigrants from voting on the grounds that they were not white, or took them to court to accuse them of miscegenation because they married white persons. Nothing in the law really prevented them from becoming naturalized citizens. But as immigrant groups, they did suffer severe discrimination. But being discriminated against is not the same as being not white. So we need to also rest this idea that somehow different groups become white. It is not historical. And by the 18th century, most colonists thought they knew what it meant to be white. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, suggested in 1751 that since the number of purely white people in the world was very small, America ought to exclude all blacks and townies. I think that means brown skin. Among them, he included not only residents of Africa and Asia, but also he saw some groups like Spaniards, Italians, Russians, and Swedes, for instance, he included in that category. This only goes to show you that race is never actually cemented in it's something that evolves with the context of the time, and it is often adapting to the changes. So as an ideology, it is easily adaptable to whatever the current group in power wants to use it as. For instance, today no one would say that a Swede is not a white person, right? And yet Benjamin Franklin had suggested as such. Um, so this is the root of the ideology of racism, which give birth to American notions of race in order to secure the supply of labor in slavery. And as we moved from the American Revolution to the next coming decades, it began to sort of harden around the notion of skin color even more. For instance, by 1790, perhaps one of the first legislation that Congress ever passed was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which specifically said naturalization can only, and naturalization, which by extension almost confers citizenship, can only be given to free white persons, right? So very early on, American racial exclusionary ideology is starting to divide as to who is deserving of being an American, who is and who isn't. Now, let me give you just a brief history of how these ideologies of racism affected global ideologies elsewhere around notions of race. For instance, in hindsight, historians of American immigration will be pressed to really name the first 2 decades of the 21st century as one that perhaps was dominated by ideas of systematic racial exclusionism of non Europeans. Why do I argue that? Well, it was in the United States that the modernization of racial difference really perfected the models for global settler colonialism. And the iteration of that we have seen in the rhetoric that you might have sort of encountered in the language of Trump as to who can enter and who cannot enter the United States, and also his adherents, whoever follows him, often is abiding by these notions of racial exclusionism, even if it's not explicitly stated. And with regards to my argument that the modernization of racial difference was perfected here in the United States through a system of settler colonialism, I want to sort of give you a sense of how those ideas even reach places like Germany, for instance. Often overlooked, W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the greatest, one of the greatest American intellectuals, an African American intellectual, made what was to become a prophetic statement in 1903, where he said the problem of the color line will be the problem of the 20th century, and in fact, we are still dealing with that problem today. But what most people didn't know is that Du Bois, as a young person, had actually spent time in Berlin in the 1890s, and as far as he understood what was emerging in Berlin with regards to forms of discrimination around the idea of the Herrenvolk, meaning a supreme race, a supreme nation, W.E.B. Du Bois was able to make the connection between ideas of race and racism that were emerging in the United States and those that were emerging in Weimar Germany in many ways. So he calls the problem of the color line as the problem of the 20th century. And this American problem, in many ways, became a part of the racial imagination of German writers. And young Adolf Hitler was among the infamous admirers of America's career in ethnic cleansing. And here I'm talking about America's experience with constantly fighting wars against Native Americans, which would end up in ethnic cleansing. And he found in the American history a tradition of cowboys versus Indian, which became part of a voyeuristic literature in Germany. Hitler observed in his book Mein Kampf in 1925, he observed that in spite of the 14th Amendment jus soli, which means right of soil or birthright citizenship, national citizenship in principle, as well as in practice, really showed a favorable disposition towards what legal theorists call jus sanguinis, meaning citizenship by blood. This racialized conception of citizenship, deployed with the aim of excluding certain races from naturalization, was imported from late 19th century America to imperial Prussia, what would later become Germany. It remained popular during and after German unification in the 1870s and lasted through both the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany. Much of Hitler's youth and education was formalized in this period as he imbibed American exports of racist ideology through the genocidal aesthetics of German Western classics literature. The Germans really appreciated American Western, the idea of the cowboy versus Indians, for what it represented to them. In many ways, German novelists began to spread these ideas around the country. And even though Germany was a latecomer to colonialism, it began to sort of pick up very fast that many of the ideas of exclusion on account of race were being perfected in the United States. So that by the 1870s, as Germans were looking for examples, they claimed to, quote, Germans are learning about the colonial skills from our Anglo-Saxon cousins and to begin a friendly competition with them. Hence, this European competition in many ways was prefaced by Jacksonian removal of Native Americans and the expansion of reservations, which reached its height in the example of Manifest Destiny, which was the movement in the 1840s and 50s that saw migration of white settlers from the east to the west. Not surprisingly, the Berlin Conference from 1884 to 1885 ended in the friendly partitioning of African territories by Western European powers. By the 20th century, a map of Africa looked more like an offshore archipelago of European fiefdoms, much the same way the American West had been conquered and subdued by the US after the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. So the Germans, looking at the United States experience with not only Native American removal under Jackson and the constant American Indian Wars, as well as John O'Sullivan, who brought up the term Manifest Destiny, begin to learn from these examples that one could actually, in effect, establish a state on account of racial purity. And to quote John O'Sullivan, who again brought up this concept of manifest destiny, this is what he had to say. Quote, the Anglo-Saxon foot is already on Mexico's borders. The advance guard of the irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon immigration will have dominion over Texas and California. So not long after these words were uttered, the Native American population of California was reduced from about 150,000 people in 1849 to fewer than 30,000 people by 1870. Between 1875 and 1885, the German Empire was fully consolidated under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And the Protectorate of the German Southwest Africa, which was a colony that Germany developed in Africa, which is today the country of Namibia, became the empire's first racial stage whereby they would practice Germany's sort of ideals of race. So in many ways, this is where they would rehearse what later would go into becoming the crimes of the Holocaust. So in terms of actually German genocide, it was first documented in Namibia. And the cruelty of this, in many ways, reflect what some of the Germans' colonial officials were thinking. For instance, the German colonialist Karl Peters expressed his view that the United States' successful settlement of the continent of North America should be an inspiration for Germany to colonize Africa. The director of the colonial office in Berlin, Bernard der Borg, I think, used westward expansion as a reference point for Germany's colonial exploits, noting that the US not only succeeded, but was the biggest colonial endeavor the world had ever known. A process begun with the complete extermination of America's native population, as he saw it. So, as early as 1928, Hitler's deep reading of American history and literature offered the Western frontiersmen as the Nazi model for how to deploy racist violence. White American settlers, he noted, quote, gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000, unquote, to make space for a so-called master class. So it would appear then that a settler colonial country such as the US lent credibility in many ways to what Adam Smith, the philosopher and economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations, once argued. Smith feared that the great expansion of the settlers throughout the North American continent would leave no room for Native Americans. This is what he had to say, for instance. At the particular time when these discoveries were made, meaning the lands, the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were enabled to commit with impunity every sort of injustice in those remote countries. Hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which, by inspiring mutual fear, can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. In other words, he saw a potential conflict emerging with the rapid settlement of the North American continent under the migration of white settlers. Even and this too itself even created theories on account of whether there is enough space for the white race to expand. So you have all these ideas about who is the master race and where should they get certain land to be able to establish themselves, right? So much of Germany's ideas, not that Germany itself was not already aware of racial ideologies, but in terms of the practice of racial ideologies, it took America as a big example for that. Now, the other thing that I want to cover real quick before I close out for some reflections between us is to sort of give you a sense of how American ideologies of race and racism combined with imperialism affected the United States relationship to Haiti. So let's think for a moment how US economic imperialism helped underdevelop Haiti. So what is interesting about Haiti and the United States is that they share a common revolutionary tradition, meaning Haiti, along with France and the United States, are part of what historians have called the Age of Revolution, right? The United States, 1776, France, 1789, and then Haiti with the big slave revolution established what was to become the first Black Republic in 1804. So altogether, they were considered as the Great Age of Revolution. But beyond their shared revolutionary origins, Haitian-U.S. foreign relations have since then been, and arguably remain, and follow me here for a moment, the stuff of bird shit is what I say. It's because it's a toxic tale of ecological capitalism and a symbol of environmental racism against the poor. For instance, much of Haiti very early on was seen by the United States not only as a threatening republic because it was Black in a time in which the US was thriving under slavery, but also that these people were people who you could argue were as disposable as waste. And the reason why I'm making this connection with bird shit and disposable waste is because literally between 1857 and 1859, the U.S. Secretary of State, Lewis Cass, employed what was called then the Guano Islands Act of 1856. The, the Guano Islands Act of 1856 was used to annex an island on the coast of Haiti called Nassau Island. This small island in the Caribbean had belonged to Haiti since 1804. But by 1856, Nassau, this little island, contained 1 million tons of valuable bird droppings as fertilizers. So the law was used specifically to authorize the U.S. president to, quote, employ the land and naval forces of the United States to protect any citizens of the United States who discovers a deposit of guano on any island, rock, or key. So to explain this to you, this is the first imperial law that the U.S. had ever passed. This is now at the point at which the U.S. is becoming very much a regional power, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but is starting to lay claims to different places around the world wherever they can find the Guano Island, which was called, some people called it the green gold because it was nothing but bird poop. And its valuable nitrogen was so rich in terms of what it provided to farmers that it revolutionized farming. And the empire of Germany, France, England were all in competition for it. So what the law did in many ways is it gave the US the same right that the 15th century popes had given to Spanish conquistadors. Just lay the claim and call it yours. So until 1898, agribusiness, including what was then called the New York Corporation of the Nassau Phosphate Company, mined Haiti's guano, an agricultural fertilizer produced from the excrement, as I said, of seabirds. As this green gold enriched U.S. soil, it fertilized the propensity to disregard Haitian territorial integrity, Haitian sovereignty. Though little known today, with this Guano Islands Act of 1856, one diplomatic historian, Roy F. Nichols, wrote, quote, the American nation took its first step into the path of imperialism. Fast forward now to half a century after that moment, William Jennings Bryan, who was at one point the Secretary of State of the United States, once noted, looking at Haiti, this is roughly in 1914, 1915, noted that, dear me, think of it, N-word speaking French, right? And this is William Jennings Bryan, who is known as one of the great individuals of the American progressive tradition. And he said this in 1915. So in 1915, political instability in Haiti had really reached a high point, and the Haitian president had been overthrown. So using this as sort of cover, the United States invaded Haiti in what lasted into a 19-year-long occupation. So in many ways, the way the United States have dealt with Haiti is not all that far too different from how we understand our former President Trump had talked about Haiti when he said, why do we need more Haitians? Take them out. And before that, he had said they all have AIDS. In fact, in the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis became a major problem, it was the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that labeled Haitians together with hemophiliacs, heroin addicts, and homosexuals as carriers and spreaders of the disease. It was what they called the 3 H's: Haitians, homosexuals, and hemophiliacs. So in many ways, William Jennings Bryan long predated Mr. Trump. Haitian domestic instability has historically served as a bipartisan justification for detractors like Trump to routinely intervene in Haitian affairs. by the first decade of the 1800s, for instance, um, Haiti had been trying to get the United States to recognize it as an established sovereign republic. But that would not happen until the 1860s during the Civil War under President Lincoln. So Haiti had lost roughly 180,000 people in the Revolutionary War that it fought against France. Now, this war is something that I call a gift and a curse. So, on the one hand, it provided a lot of aspirations to enslave people in the United States, but at the same time, it actually entrenched American slavery even more. And how that happened was as a result of the victory of these former enslaved people against the French Empire, Napoleon had little choice but to actually sell the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in many ways, was a consequence of the Haitian Revolution. So on the one hand, you have this great moment of the triumphant slave revolutionaries, but at the same time, the purchase of Louisiana territory opened the United States to not only double its size, but also a booming slave trade. And as a result, also further pushing Native Americans off their land. So, hence, a gift and a curse. So, in essence, this was the greatest real estate deal in US history, but not only did it facilitate further enslavement of Black people, it also uprooted and led to the expulsion of indigenous people from their homelands. So it was against this backdrop of US territorial expansion on the one hand and Haitian anti-slavery and anti-colonialism on the other that the underdevelopment of Haiti began to sort of connect with multiple policies of the United States. And one of those policies you could see in the way that France treated Haiti in the first couple decades after independence. So on July 3rd, 1825, a French diplomat arrived along with a number of warships and 528 cannons, surrounded the island and demand that Haiti pay reparations for property losses that were lost during the war. Now, what this means is Haiti had to effectively recognize that in gaining their independence, France having lost its slaves meant that it lost property, in effect, seeing the people as the property that it wants back. So, as a result, Haiti had to pay 150 million francs, which later was renegotiated to 90 million francs. Today, that stands at about 20 billion and more that Haiti has been impoverished by. Now, where was the United States in that moment? Well, the 1820s just happened to have been when President Monroe declared the Monroe Doctrine, which was necessarily supposed to be the fact that the Caribbean was now the enclave for American expansion with regards to imperialism. And yet, that kind of French intervention into bullying Haiti to pay for reparations, the US did not do much about it. So, this debt was so great that by the 1880s, a staggering 80% of national expenditures went to financing the debt. The 20% that remained could not support internal investment in education, healthcare, public infrastructures, and other sectors. So cash strapped that Haiti was that it borrowed from French banks and German firms to finance interest payments to the national debt. And Haitian officials then turned to US financiers to raise more funds by issuing sovereign bonds for domestic expenditures. So in order to pay the debt, Haiti had to then borrow from French banks, who then also held the Haitian National Treasury in Paris. And by the time you get to the 1890s, as the debt was accumulating, it was bought over by the United States. And you had a transfer of the debt from France's Societe Generale, which is a multinational financial firm today. It transferred the debt over to what was then known as New York City Bank, which is the predecessor to today's Citibank. Okay. Now all that debt is then held by the United States, and on account of that, when you get to the 1900s, by 1915, not only was Haiti becoming so impoverished by the debt, it is also causing more tensions on top of the political tensions that already existed. So, in many ways, in sort of financial parlance, the Haitian debt was being shorted by American financiers. And as Haiti was unable to pay, the financiers here in Wall Street, New York, where I am, were able to convince the State Department to deploy the U.S. Marines to, in effect, take the Haitian National Treasury and redeposit it effectively, physically on Wall Street and at Citibank. So, I'm hoping to sort of show you here is you get from the moment of identifying an ideology to enslave African Americans, and that ideology being racism, which, like I said, produces race in order to lock up a supply of labor, right? And the development of a Black Republic in the Caribbean then becomes a threat to the United States. And for that reason and other factors, the United States refuses to recognize Haiti for almost 6 decades. And in the time that it does not recognize Haiti, France imposes a debt which then is bought over by the United States and which will not be paid fully until 1947. So 1825 to 1947. So if you want to understand why, quote unquote, why is Haiti so poor, you best look at its relationship with American imperialism as well as French imperialism. And in the same context, Germany too was one of the stakeholders of the Haitian debt. At the same time that Germany was borrowing ideas around race and racism that it then deployed in Namibia and later on, which really came back home in terms of the European metropole to necessarily build up on anti-Semitic ideologies that then devolve into the Holocaust. So I know I've spoken a bit too much. I'm going to stop there, and then we can discuss further.